Good afternoon, everybody. Have your attention. My name is John Nucci. I'm Senior Vice President for External Affairs here at Suffolk University, and welcome. And welcome to all of those who are viewing this online at bostonglobe.com. This is the 5th event that we have had with the Boston Globe in this Suffolk University Boston Globe Political Happy Hour. And we are pleased and we are very, very proud to be partnering with the Boston Globe to bring to you these types of discussions with the area and the region's top political leaders. Today is no exception. And I'm particularly pleased to know that Congressman Joseph Kennedy is joining us today. Clearly, his family needs no introduction to anybody here, to anybody across the country, or even the world. But as we all watch Congressman Joe Kennedy at the beginning of his political career, we are clearly seeing those flashes of dedication, of determination in working on the types of issues that are important to all of us, particularly us here at Suffolk University, such as education, such as income inequality. So we are very proud to do this. It is my pleasure to be a part of it. And let's waste no time, and let me hand this over to Josh Miller of the Boston Globe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at Suffolk University, and thank you to everyone who's joining us online at bostonglobe.com. I hope everyone will sign up for the newsletter from which this event takes its name at bostonglobe.com/political happy hour. Thanks to Suffolk University and thanks to John for the introduction. But most of all, thank you to Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy III. Joe. Thanks to Joe for, let's give him a big round of applause. Thanks for being here, Congressman. I appreciate it. So you and your wife have a big event coming up soon.
We do. So my wife and I are expecting our first child in about a month. Due date is actually right around Christmas. She is doing wonderfully. Thank you for asking. I am freaking out, which I think is probably about the way it's supposed to be. Crib came last weekend, which definitely made it very real, and very, very excited, and more than a little bit terrified. But I've got a twin brother who he's now got a 2-year-old. And so about 6 or 7 months ago, I asked him, I said, hey, any advice? What did I do? What did I read? And, what did you do? And he said, there's a bunch of books and stuff you can read, but really more than anything else, you just read this one book. It's called The Home Game by Michael Lewis. And I was like, didn't that guy write The Blind Side? And yes, he did. So I didn't know he was an expert on fatherhood, but my brother pointed me to the introduction where he said it's the most powerful lesson a new dad could ever take from it, where he basically, and I hope for the fathers in the room, maybe you can shine some light on this, but he writes, it's parenthood from a new dad's perspective. And he said, from this moment on, your wife will forever view you as an unreliable employee. Which is starting to seem about right. So we're embracing those new roles and very excited.
Have you chosen a name?
We have not quite chosen a name yet, although I'm pretty certain it's going to end up being whatever she wants. So we're trying to guide that process a little bit.
Yeah. All right.
We'll see.
Has the nervousness increased as the timeline shortens?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And obviously, look, first child, so first time, soon to be first time father. So I don't know what it's like for everybody else going through this, but when you initially find out it's 9 months away and you say, oh, this is amazing, this is exciting, this is scary, I've got 9 months to figure it out, we'll figure it out. And I kept telling myself I had 9 months to figure it out until about end of October. And then it was like, okay, you got 6 weeks, and one of my friends who's here, I think their first child came about 6 weeks early. So it was at that point where I went, oh, that 6-week buffer might not be such a buffer after all. So we've been diving into still policy papers and newspapers, and interspersed with different baby books that I'm cramming as into the night. So I try to keep those different things straight. But when you start when I mix up, major federal policy with sleep patterns, where it's probably been a little bit too much cramming.
Speaking of names, I'm told you were nicknamed the Milkman at Stanford University. Is that true?
This story's been exaggerated. It becomes so much more exaggerated than it was.
Tell me the real one.
So there was I played lacrosse at Stanford, and I don't drink. Every now and again I'll have a celebratory toast or something, but I don't drink. So, and I didn't in college. So when we were having team festivities or something, at some point somebody went into when we were at a bar, ordered a big tall glass of milk and put that on the table, and that was my drink for the night. And so some folks ended up calling me Milkman. That nickname kind of lasted for about 2 weeks, and then it got revived when I ran for Congress again, and I haven't been able to live it down since. So, but yes, so it is. There is some truth to it. Yes.
Okay, only some truth to it. Though. You said you don't drink. Tell me about that.
It was never something that I was ever drawn to when I was younger and through high school and college, and just a choice that I made and something that I've never really felt any real pressure to do otherwise. So I had, I think, a beer on my 21st birthday, and then when I graduated and from college, and then I was in Ireland last summer, so my wife basically put the celebratory Guinness and said, "You realize you have to drink this," which I did. And but other than that, that's basically it, and it's just something that I kind of steer away from.
Understand. Sticking with the theme, I want to ask you about your last name, and it's a relatively potent one. Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General and Senator, was your grandfather, and the former Congressman Joe Kennedy is your father, and JFK and Teddy Kennedy were your great uncles, right? So in a recent story about the Kennedy family, there's a quote that really struck me. It's from Philip W. Johnston, the former state Democratic Party chairman who has ties with the Kennedy family. He said, "Young Joe is at the moment the protector of the legacy." Is that how you see yourself?
No, not at all. Thank you, though, Phil. Look, I'm very proud of what my family has done and has contributed in the efforts that they've made for our country and for our community and for public service. And it's something that I hold very dear to me, whether it was those members that you mentioned, a number of other of my family members, I think writ large, that have found their own way to contribute. Obviously, our cousins, the Shrivers, that have done everything from Special Olympics to Save the Children to Best Buddies, and an awful lot of other initiatives that they continue to push as well. I think, though, that every person, at least I think the message that my family has tried to send is that to us, and I think to others, is that everybody can find a way to contribute, and you find your own way. And as now a sophomore member of the minority party of the second least popular Congress of all time, you do what you can. And I've been really blessed and really fortunate to be able to be in a position at times where I think I can find a way to contribute, whether it was from as an assistant district attorney here, as a Peace Corps volunteer, now in an elective office. But I think, if anything, I'd like to think that the message that my family has stood for is the fact that everybody can find a way to make a contribution. So I try to find my own.
If not you, though, do you think there needs to be someone in the family to ensure that the cause endures, the hope, the legacy still lives?
And the dream shall never die.
Exactly.
I think when my uncle spoke those words, that was the hope and the dreams, obviously, of Americans that he had met over the course of a lifetime in public service and over a presidential campaign. And that hope, I think that hope will always endure. That doesn't mean that there's everybody has to find their own way to bring that forward and to make their contribution to it. And again, I think that's been an area that I am proud that my family continues to try to say is every single one of us, every single one of you, many of you in this room have found your own way to make that contribution. As teachers, as members of the military, as volunteers, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, mentors, city year volunteers, whatever that is, and however that is, whether it's formal or informal. And that, I think, is an extraordinary compliment to our character. It's also the way that you build and foster and invest in a community. And that, I think, is at least the message that I take away from what my family's done and tried to contribute, and one that I'm proud of.
But you don't think there's anyone who needs to be in charge of keeping the legacy alive in some way?
I mean, no. That's...
It's a media construct, you think?
Partially. And again, look, I'm proud of what the contribution they've made. I don't think that's something that anyone can continue to try to compare themselves to. Look, I think my relatives, my grandfather's great uncles, and my great aunt, and my namesake. They made some pretty extraordinary contributions to our country, and to try to say that, I think the message that, again, that they live for and that they stood for was, you find your own way and you find your own path. And as long as you do that, I think you do your part.
I want to ask you about the John F. Kennedy Library, which is run by a partnership of the federal government and a private foundation. There's been a very major exodus of employees there since Heather Campion was appointed chief executive of the foundation last year in March. My colleague Jim O'Sullivan reported there's been a plunge in morale, a deterioration in relations between the foundation and the federal archives, and questions raised by former JFK aides. Does the environment there concern you?
Look, I don't have any formal relationship, obviously, with the library or with the foundation. I will say it's obviously an organization I care an awful lot about, and we want to make sure it stands strong and continues to be a source of education for the greater public about what President Kennedy stood for and his administration, and that people can learn from what he did over the course of his tenure there. There's also, with the when Heather came in and took over, she got the support of the board and came in to move the organization in a different direction. So I think part of that change and turnover is healthy. I think the critical thing going forward is that there is more communication, people are bought in around it, and there's a clear idea of what's going forward, and I think they're working on that. So I don't have any major concerns over what's happening at this point.
Do you think it's time for a change in leadership there?
I haven't seen that yet, no.
Okay. So you don't think it's time for a change in leadership?
I
at the
think
JFK Foundation?
No, I don't.
Okay. One more set of Kennedy family-related questions. Patrick Kennedy.
Only one?
Only one. It's a set, though. I'm curious what you think of a common struggle, a personal journey through the past and future of mental illness and addiction. It brought a sharp rebuke from his brother, Ted Kennedy Jr., who said it's an inaccurate and unfair portrayal of our family. Have you read it?
I've not read it.
Why not?
I'm sorry?
Why not?
Between the policy papers, the newspapers, and the baby books, the reading stack has been pretty high of late. So I'm sure I'll read it at some point. It hasn't gotten there yet, or I haven't gotten there yet. And look, I think Patrick, I'm proud of him. I love him. He's a friend and a family member, obviously. And I think truly one of the country's leading advocates for mental health awareness, mental health reform, mental illness in our country. He was in Congress. He was one of the lead proponents and architects of the Mental Health Parity Act that was passed several years ago. And since leaving Congress, which is actually rare, has been able to continue to elevate his voice and the profile of that mission since he left elected office. So he deserves an awful lot of credit and for his efforts there. And I think the book has helped generate that even into a broader discussion. So I'm proud of him.
He's taken the lead, as you said, on issues of mental health, and you have recently as well. You've expressed pretty sharp concern about proposed two health insurance mergers between Aetna and Humana and Cigna and Anthem. What's your worry, and why are you speaking out about this?
So, great question. There's 5 major health insurance companies in the country, and with these 2 proposed mergers that you mentioned, Josh, you could potentially go down to 3. There is, as I'm sure many of you know or might be aware, already a extreme lack of access to treatment in our mental health community. So there's 55% of our counties across the country. There's not a single practicing psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker. So that access to mental health care is absolutely critical. The concern that I have is with these mergers, you could potentially see access to mental health services basically be decreased rather than expanded. And so the point of the letter that I wrote to federal regulators and to the CEOs of those companies was to say, we're watching this very closely. Let's make sure that as these mergers do go forward, if they do go forward, that there is a keen eye on ensuring that that the access to mental health services will be expanded and not contracted.
You mentioned you're in the minority party. Are there Republicans in Congress who share your concerns? Did anyone else sign on to that letter, for example?
There were other folks that signed on to the letter, I believe. Other Republicans, I don't think so. That's not to say that other Republicans aren't concerned about it. And I think, look, we're having a big debate right now, actually. We had a markup last week on a big mental health bill, and access to care is a critical piece of this. It's one of the side pieces that I've been focused on, and we're in a bit of a robust debate with our Republican colleagues about how to ensure that access. it will be a critical part of the discussion going forward. So the concern around access is something that is, I think, broadly shared. The strategies and the tactics about how we go about getting there is something we got to work on.
You said no Republicans had signed on to that letter. Do you think there's a reticence among Republicans to sign on to a letter with a Kennedy?
No, I don't. Absolutely not. Look, some of my best friends in Congress are Republicans.
Like who?
So I'll give you a couple of names. Hopefully they won't get primaried, but you never know. So it goes. So Mark Wayne Mullen, coming at you, pal. Mark Wayne Mullen's one of my best friends in Congress. He is from Oklahoma. He is a former cage fighter, literally. He started a little workout group in the morning where I essentially get up at about 5:45 in the morning, go down to the house gym and get yelled at and humiliated by a former cage fighter, which is, after you go through that, the rest of the day in Congress seems pretty easy. So that's kind of the way it literally keeps you out of bed in the morning because, dear God, what else could possibly be such a rude awakening? So I've gotten to know him really well. There's a group of Republicans that's a predominant, there's probably 6 or 7 of us that are part of that group, and we've collaborated on a number of different issues. So I'll give you a couple of names. I don't want to rat out other people here, but Todd Rokita from Indiana is another member who's there often in the morning. He and I, it turns out, so we got a letter, Josh, it was probably about maybe 2 years ago or so now, from a Boston-based company called Air Pooler, who was having some trouble with, or a mass challenge winner, and they're having troubles with the FAA around some regulations that would basically preclude end their business model. It turns out, and I didn't know, but we found out that Todd Rokita happened to be the chairman of the House, I believe it was Aviation Caucus. He's a pilot. So we were able to reach out with him and write a letter with him to the FAA asking for clarification on some of these rules as it was going to impact that company. So look, just because we both get yelled at by Mark Wayne every morning doesn't mean that we're going to agree on everything. We agree that that is a rather unpleasant experience, and that in and of itself gives you the opportunity to just talk to people that around issues that aren't based on politics. So you find out that, Republicans are actually people too, and they, they got kids, they got families, they have some of the same pressures that everybody has when you're running for office. They've got likes, they've got dislikes, there's areas of interest and overlap, and I think that is, look, one of the critical pieces that doesn't get highlighted all that much in Washington these days is, yes, look, it's hard and it's frustrating, particularly for a member of the minority party in the House of Representatives, where, for those of you that aren't so aware, the majority really does get to set the rules, set the agenda, and run the table. There aren't the protections that there are in the Senate for minorities, or for the minority party. There are, though, plenty of opportunities to try to find the issues that might not be as high profile in the day. So healthcare reform, immigration reform, taxes, to go down a level and try to find ways that you can chip away at some of these issues that do affect everybody across the country. We've been working with a number of Republicans on opioid legislation. I was able to get a bill through around creating these manufacturing institutes last cycle, my first term in Congress, the first big bill I was able to get through. It took over 2 years. Well, no, not over 2 years. It took about a year and a half to be able to get it through the House. By the time it got to the House floor, not a single member of Congress voted against it. So you can look at that two ways. It took 18 months to bring a bill to the floor and get a vote that no one objected to, so why did it take so long? You can also look at it and say, look, if you do this, you build up a coalition of willing Republicans and Democrats, and you go piece by piece, and you make the case to House leadership and Republican leadership, Democrat leadership, Republican leadership, and put those pieces together, you can actually get something through.
But the final vehicle, it went to the president and was something else, right?
The final vehicle went to the president. It was an omnibus, so we were able to get it out of the House. It was then you start to realize as you go through this why it was this process is so complicated, and it is in fact hard to pass bills. So it got out of the House. It then went to the Senate. It was senators can place an anonymous hold on a bill, so they don't have to say who and they don't have to say why. And we kind of got to throw darts and guess and to try to figure out how to move it through. we were able to, when the omnibus bill came together essentially a year ago this time, we were able to get it attached to that process so that it was a way to get, at the end of the year on a must-pass piece of legislation, to get an important piece of legislation attached to it.
And how did you vote on this final
So
vote of this
this
bill
is-
that you had spent 2 years
I
working
had-
really hard to get?
Believe it or not, and this could be hard for people to perhaps stomach, and harder for me to stomach, I had to vote no. So I voted no on the omnibus bill because it, and I'm sure we'll dive into this, had funding for a war in Syria that I did not support, and I do not support at this point. That I've made it clear when the president came to Congress a little over a year ago and started talking about deploying troops into Iraq and carrying out airstrikes in Syria. I don't believe that the existing legal authorities gave the president, the administration, the legal authority to do so. And I didn't believe that the strategy that they had outlined would work, this train and equip mission, which it turns out our train and equip mission has not worked. And Congress is supposed to have this debate and authorize it. Congress never has and has yet to take up a vote on it.
Why not?
I voted no on that, and because I voted no on the initial train and equip mission, it got wrapped up in this omnibus bill, and I figured that, look, as much as as hard as I worked on that manufacturing bill, and as critical as it is to our manufacturing industry, and as successful as some of these examples have been already around the country, and they have been, when it comes down to issues of war and peace, that's the fundamental responsibility that we have. And I didn't feel like, even though I had my own piece of legislation wrapped up in this broader bill, that if you're trying to measure all of the pieces that are in there, that was enough to say, I'm going to vote to authorize funds to a war that I don't think we've debated and authorized. So I felt compelled to vote no.
Why do you think you're pretty politically savvy? I'm curious why you think that there hasn't been a vote to authorize this ongoing military use of military force in Iraq and Syria and against ISIS.
I'm not so sure how politically savvy I would be, but nevertheless.
Well, I'm curious here. Either way,
Either way,
I'm
right.
curious on your answer.
So, look, I ever since the president came out and talked about his train and equip mission, I have been one of the few folks in Congress, and this is really, truly bipartisan. There's a letter that just went to, that was signed last week and sent out from, I think it was about 35 members of the House, almost evenly split, I believe, Democrats and Republicans. Senator Tim Kaine and Jeff Flake, Democrat and Republican in the Senate, have been outspoken on this as well. So there really is bipartisan support for people in Congress saying we need to have a vote on this and we need to debate this. We need to understand what our goals are in Syria. What does success look like? Who's part of that mission? Which allies? Which allies are going to bring which assets to this fight? How long are we going to be there? And what burden are we putting on our men and women in uniform and their families? And what are we asking our taxpayers to shoulder? And until we can have that discussion and that debate, I don't think we should be sending troops in to fight a war when we don't even understand what the goals and the objectives of it are. So, look, the administration, at least about a year ago, not quite a year ago, put forth an authorization, a draft authorization for the use of military force, which I did not support because of some of the technical details that was contained in there. Congress has yet to debate it, to mark it up, to move it through a committee, nothing. And that is, in my opinion, an abrogation of the responsibility of the House of Representatives and the Senate to actually work its way through on a really, really tough issue, but it's a critical piece to what we're supposed to do.
But again, why do you think that hasn't happened? I hear that you think it should happen and should have happened already, but why don't you think
I think it hasn't happened because it's a tough issue, and two, it's a tough vote. But look, our job is, I've taken a couple of votes that I think are tough votes since I've been down there. Our job isn't to duck those tough votes, it's to actually ensure that our voices are clear on those tough votes, and in the course of that debate, that we hear what our strategy actually is and how we plan on addressing all of the challenges and the complexities that is, at this point, Syria and ISIS and Iraq, and how we engage Europe the GCC, our other Gulf partners in the region to try to come up with a strategy there that leads to, that one, stops the fighting, creates a space for a transition, has Assad leave, and then comes up with what that next transition period is, which is not, and I think we've seen over the course of the past 15 years or so in the Middle East, we have the most competent and capable military force ever created in the history of mankind. These battles are not easy, but our men and women in uniform are able to basically, at this point, neutralize those threats and accomplish those missions. The political process that happens thereafter has been a disaster. And what I think Congress, the administration, State Department, Defense Department, others need to hash out is not just what's the military strategy for stopping ISIS, but then what is the political strategy that comes next to say that there's going to be a viable Syria that happens next? Or if there's not, what does that look like and who's the caretaker? Because I do not support the United States going in and basically having to fight another war and rebuild another Middle Eastern country. We've tried that a couple of times, and it's been a pretty high price.
You said the reason that there hasn't been that vote is because it would be a hard vote. I'm curious what you mean by that. Can you just unpack that a little bit more?
I just think that I think there's the challenges around Syria. The more and more you dive into the details, the harder and more complex the problem gets. That being said, we have to, particularly when it gets to the point when we start to send our men and women in uniform, in this case special forces, up to 50 special forces folks, if we're going to ask those individuals to risk their lives and put themselves in essentially on the front lines of that conflict, then we have to be willing to understand that what Congress should do is have a debate and vote on this and understand that, look, that strategy is going to be imperfect and that information unclear, but so is the challenge that we're also giving our men and women in uniform, and we shouldn't be sidestepping that because they can't, and we're asking them to do it.
I want to turn to an issue closer to home. You've been very vocal in your support of a state bill aimed at protecting transgender people from discrimination in restaurants, malls, public accommodations. Several other states already have such protections. I want to ask you a similar question to what I asked about the authorization of military force. Why do you think there's been a holdup in passing this in Massachusetts?
So I can't speak to the details, obviously, of what's going on inside the walls of Beacon Hill. What I can say is, if you look at our neighboring states, so Maine's done it, Vermont's done it, Rhode Island's done it, Connecticut's done it, New England. We've got Maryland that's done it. You've got New Jersey that's done it. You've got Washington, D.C. that already have all passed these protections. And this is something that is important to me personally. I've had the opportunity to meet with members of the transgender community, meet with some very young boys and girls in the transgender community, meet with their parents. And folks, you spend some time with people that are struggling through literally living their day-to-day lives with confronting challenges that, candidly, I take for granted every single day without even thinking about it. I never have had to think about how I was going to plan my day around a restroom that I could use. Not even something that would enter my mind. I never had to think about, if I was driving down to Washington, D.C., when I was going to eat or drink to be able to time my bathroom breaks to rest stops. And what it was the challenges that my 4 or 5-year-old little boy or little girl was going to face when I still couldn't protect them 10 or 15 years from now. And Massachusetts has a long and proud history of leading on these issues, on civil rights, on LGBT rights, and I think residents here are proud of that reputation, and it's surprising that we haven't already done this. It's an issue for me because I am and others are trying to fight for these protections on a federal level down in Washington, and Massachusetts does have a reputation for leading on this, and so when Massachusetts isn't leading on it, the fact that our name is off that list is noticeable. And it's one thing if you're saying, hey, it would be nice if we were the first state. If you're not the first, the second, or the third, when there's 17 other states and D.C. that have done it, you start saying, hey, why not here?
How much responsibility for it not being law here do you put on Governor Charlie Baker, who has not taken a position on this particular round and previous iterations of the bill was opposed to it?
Look, I think Governor Baker has on the whole a really strong record on LGBT rights, and I think I read recently that he, in the past couple of weeks, has had an opportunity, like I did, to sit down with members of the LGBT community and the transgender community and hear some of those concerns. And look, that moment was a powerful one for me, and I hope that as this debate goes on, that it'll be a powerful one for him too.
How do you think he's done as governor so far? He's about 10 and a half months in.
I think he's done well. I do. I've had a chance to sit down with him, personally, and I think he's taken on some challenges, and I think he's really done a pretty good job.
Governing as, how would you say it, a moderate?
Yeah, I think he's done a good job of addressing the challenges that have come up across his desk and trying to, particularly early on in his tenure here, use the ability of his administration to address those concerns. And so I give him credit, and I think on this issue, I hope he comes around.
On DraftKings and daily fantasy sports generally?
Yes.
I'm curious on your take. Have you ever played one of those
No.
games?
So
Are they gambling?
I played fantasy football. I'll get to that. I played fantasy football like 3 years in a row. And my twin brother had a league. I played once. He invited me to play. I played once and I lost. So he invited me back, and I lost again. So he invited me back. And at that point, I was smart enough to be like, "Yeah, I'm not doing this again." So I've never done the daily sports fantasy stuff. And after losing 3 years in a row, and I'm fairly certain, see that or a March Madness pool, that he would make sure that if you actually lost, you got your, we'd play $5 or $10 or whatever the thing was. You got your entry fee back in pennies. So I got a big sock of pennies back as like the humiliation factor. So after getting a couple of those, I said, "No mas, I'm done." So I've done that. I learned my lesson. Said no more. The daily fantasy or the daily fantasy sports stuff. Haven't done, never played it. I think with regards to the debate that's going on here currently in Massachusetts, the big challenge there is that I think the regulatory framework, federal and state, is unclear. The State Gaming Commission said that it's actually unclear. You've got a governor that's saying it's not, or it is legal. You've got an attorney general that's saying, well, there's not a law that necessarily prohibits it, but it should be regulated, and is coming up with, and I applaud her for diving into it and trying to come up with some guidance. You've got the federal laws essentially dictate some of this to the states, and we're seeing a patchwork of states that are some who have said outright no, some who have said initially no, some and now some where it was allowed initially and now prohibited, Nevada. So I really think that, look, this is an example where you've got a new and innovative business model that has found a niche where they can actually start to grow a booming business, and government hasn't kept up with that, and the regulation hasn't kept up with that.
The federal government too? Do you think
federal government too? Absolutely.
Do you think there needs to be a bill to clarify?
I think having some guidance here from the federal government and state governments about where these parameters are and how they should be regulated certainly seems to make sense. I can't tell you exactly what that looks like at this point.
So it could be regulatory or it could be legislation?
Yeah, I think, look, again, from somebody that hasn't played it and is learning a bit more about it, there's a potential that some of this is going to come before the committee that I sit on at some point in the next couple of months. So I certainly look forward to learning some more about it, about saying, hey, how do these pieces fit together? I think the issue when you end up with a federal regulatory landscape that is unclear and then a patchwork of state regulatory landscapes that are also unclear leads to a lot of unclarity, if that's even a word. So I think it's our job then as policymakers, state level and federal level, to try to iron that out.
So you're open to there being some kind of federal statutory clarification about where these games fit in?
Yeah, certainly open to it, and I would have to dive into it a little bit more to try to see how that all balances out.
Open to it. But that could be something that Congress should do. Okay. The gaming, another sort of gaming question, or not gaming question, if you don't believe that is gaming, depending on where it falls. There's a big push for an Indian casino in Taunton, which is in your district. Do you believe a casino in your district would, on balance, be a net positive or net negative for your constituents?
So my I support the casino in Taunton. My position on this has been that, look, when you are...
So you believe it would be a net positive for your constituents?
I do. But
Why?
so the approach that I've tried to take to the proposed casinos in my district, and at one point there was potentially 5. So now the one that is furthest in development clearly is this one in Taunton, was to recognize that this was going to be a major local economic development and issue. And I think under those circumstances, the agreements that are forged between the developers of the casino and the owners of the casino and the local community is absolutely critical. So there's certainly ways there where, under the right circumstances, where that can be a net bonus for the community, add additional revenue, particularly for emergency services, for law enforcement, firefighters, police officers, which are desperately needed, and sources of revenue that are desperately needed in communities like Taunton, let alone schools and other sources of funding that can actually go in and fund the municipal budget. That doesn't mean that it's the right thing for every community, or that if those agreements are worked out differently, that it should get the support of the local community. So my stance on it has been, if the local community supports it, then I will do my best to advocate for their wishes and the needs of the local community. And the local community has Taunton voted overwhelmingly to support that casino. So it really, in my mind, if the local community can hash out a good agreement that they believe is going to be in the overall benefit to the community, then I'm happy to lodge my support behind it.
Have you ever been to a casino and gambled in one?
Been to a casino, yes. Gambled in one, I'm sure I have. I'm pretty sure I lost.
Okay.
But I'm not a big gambler. I'm sure. I've been to Las Vegas a couple times. I'm certain I sat down at a blackjack table. I don't even know how to play craps. I'm sure I'd played roulette. I've got a good friend in college that I would bet on red. He would bet on black, and I think I definitely lost that one. We actually went, if I remember correctly, and this is not a good story.
Thanks for the warning.
I was going to say, I said, hey, let's go. I'll bet on red. You bet on black. He said, I don't have any money. I said, okay, well, here's $10, and you can take my money. And then we realized that I was just getting my money back because it was a 00. Like the numbers. This is why I don't gamble, folks. Right? Like it was not a smart move. So anyway.
Speaking of putative,
follow that one up.
Speaking of putative vices, as a Brookline resident, you will most likely have the opportunity to vote on a ballot question that would legalize marijuana for adult recreational use in November of next year. How will you vote? What's your thinking on that issue? And is there a space for the federal government to get involved?
Yeah, great question. So still reviewing the language of those ballot initiatives as they go forward. I have reservations around the full-out legalization of marijuana. And think at this point would be voting against it.
And do you think there's been some talk about moving where marijuana is as a FDA Schedule I substance to something a little less restrictive? Is that something you would support?
Yeah. So look, I think the question that I've been focused on with regards to marijuana at this point has been the debate that we're having here and other communities across the country and in Washington around the potential use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And what I've heard and the research that we've done and tried to dive into, look, you hear stories from patients that are in pain and suffering and say that marijuana provides a necessary degree of comfort from the pain that they're feeling. And so I understand that, I hear that, my heart goes out to them. We then, as the federal government, if it's going to be used for a medicinal purpose, have, I think, a responsibility to ensure that that substance, if it is a medicine, is treated like a medicine and puts in the safeguards to ensure that patients know what they're getting, understand the dosage, understand the substance, and those side effects are mitigated. We have a process by which that all of those substances go through to become classified as a medicine. We need to make sure that if we do think that marijuana should be classified as medicine, we have the research to back that up and put it through that process. And so I've reached out to DEA and HHS, Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, to try to get an update of where this is and what needs to happen in order to make sure that we get the research done right so that we can put this through the process to understand the qualification or the classification to get it basically classified as a medicine if necessary, right? No. So I guess that's it.
Okay. I want to ask you about the intersection of race and criminal justice, which has been such a big topic in the last year or so. The director of the FBI last month essentially said that restraint by police following sharp criticism is at least somewhat to blame for an uptick in violent crime in some cities. Is he right?
I don't think so. I haven't seen any. I haven't seen those statistics or anything that to point that out. Look. I was a prosecutor for several years in 2 different counties in Massachusetts. I have utmost respect for and appreciation for law enforcement, the risks that they take as a low, as a new DA and a low-level district attorney in court every single day. You spend an awful lot of time reading police reports about the bad stuff that happens on a daily basis for police officers. And so grateful for their service and what they do. There is undoubtedly, though, a conversation, and more than that, action that needs to take place in this country to ensure that the people that are being protected by police officers in our community and by law enforcement writ large feel that they are, in fact, that their needs are being met and that they are being protected. And our communities have to do, law enforcement community, particularly now communities of color, where this has manifested itself so vigorously. We have to find a way to make sure that we ensure, or to build that trust back up, because at least in the conversations that I've had with law enforcement when I was a prosecutor and since, good police work is based on trust in that community. And when you're either trying to track down drug dealers or understand or work sources or really identify who the bad guys are, it's based on, you have to have people in that community that trust you. And if those communities, for whatever reason, feel like that trust isn't there with law enforcement's not going to be as effective as we all need them to be. And so this is a conversation that's ongoing now. It's obviously ongoing in Washington. It's ongoing in our communities across the country. And I think we got to continue to push for some of those reforms.
The Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah.
What's your feeling on that?
I think it's giving voice to extraordinary frustration that people are feeling. And so you certainly got to take that into account and understand that, look, the frustrations that people are feeling at this point, frustrations are certainly legitimate. And to the extent that people are saying, whether that's economic, whether it's through our criminal justice system, whether it's through other fundamental aspects of society, if society is not addressing those concerns, that is a challenge for us all. And we got to do a better job of making sure our institutions address them. So that it's certainly a focus of mine. I think part of the challenge is trying to ensure that the reforms that we're working on in Washington are sufficiently tailored to some of those concerns that you see get manifested in local communities, where sometimes they're not different, but they are unique. And so trying to make sure that we get that, we target it the right way, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. I want to ask you a few other questions, this one about foreign policy. There's been a lot of increased violence in Israel and the Palestinian territories of late. And the White House has now said that a 2-state solution probably won't be possible during the rest of President Obama's tenure. I'm curious, do you believe that Israel bears some responsibility for the peace process being stalled for so many years now?
Look, I think there is... I've been to Israel a couple of times over the course of the past couple of years. The loss of life, whether that's in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and other communities around Israel or the West Bank, is absolutely tragic. And I was at a celebration, memorial service of sorts for Richard Lakin, one of the victims of recent violence in Jerusalem. He was in his mid-70s, was on a bus and was stabbed and shot, and had roots here in Newton. He dedicated his life, somewhat ironically, to bringing peace and understanding and bridging the gap between Israelis and Palestinians. I believe wholeheartedly that the only way this violence stops is when we get to a two-state solution that is recognized by Israel, by Palestinian government, and by the rest of the world. The United States, I believe, has an obligation to continue to do all it can in order to bring those sides together. It's, yes, on the one hand, a challenging time. It's also a region of the world that is, their status quo is often more challenging than many other parts of the world. So the message when I've gone to Israel and when I've come back and when I talk to members of the community here, when I talk to advocates in Washington, look, this never should be about pointing fingers in either direction. It's about the focus, I believe, should be on what can the United States do, what can I do to actually try to find a way to move the ball a little bit forward towards peace. And that's a responsibility that I think certainly the United States government has, as well as Israelis and as well as Palestinians and as well as their governments, right?
Yeah, and not to belabor the point, but some say that continued Israeli settlement activity is a barrier to the continued peace process. I'm wondering whether you believe that to be true.
And the violent attacks orchestrated in Jerusalem are going to be a barrier to the peace process too, right? So, again, I don't think pointing fingers in one direction or another is actually helpful to getting us there. Long-standing U.S. policy has been and is against the continued use of settlements, right? Or the continued construction of settlements. We have to find a way to get beyond the tit for tat of what's taken place in the violence in the Middle East to finding a way to get to let's ensure that this tit for tat doesn't go on for yet another generation, because the tragic we had at that memorial service a video from Richard Lakin's son, and I believe he mentioned his young children, so his grandkids. You don't want to see, I don't want to see, and no one wants to see another round of violence that transpires so that another set of grandkids is talking about that loss and destruction. Right? We all bear a responsibility in that.
Yeah. Final foreign policy question for you. You obviously expressed disagreement with the fact that there hasn't been a vote on the authorization for military force regarding the Islamic State. Are there other places where you feel like, and the White House did put one forward, but are there places where you feel like President Obama has missed the mark on foreign policy since you've become a congressman?
So I think, look, he inherited an extraordinarily challenging foreign policy dynamic, right? Probably the one of the most challenging since World War II. And so not just in terms of the challenges he faced, but in terms of the tools that he faced in order to address them. With two long-standing wars, a public that understood how unpopular they were, and a military that had been asked to bear an extraordinary burden for a very, very long period of time. So trying to find ways to address it, I think, is challenging. Where I think one region of the globe that I think the administration and Congress, and I've been trying to advocate for this, needs to focus on more is right in our backyard. South America, Central America, and South America. There's an awful lot of good stuff that is going on in our region, and hardly anybody ever talks about it. Hardly anybody ever focuses on. You don't read many articles in the news, major publications or otherwise, about economic ties between the United States and either in Central America or major countries in South America. To the extent that we do hear stuff coming out of Central America now, it's off around some of the challenges Brazil is facing or a narcotics trade in Mexico and some of the violence in Mexico.
So you feel like there hasn't been enough emphasis from the White House highlighting what's going on?
Our robust trade, our potential for more economic development, the cultural ties that we have with many countries in Central America, and the fact that we spend an awful lot of time looking east and west. You got an awful lot of people that are south too, and we should be focusing an awful lot there. Where one, they're not they're not nearly as far away. There's robust markets that are there. There's folks that are have strong ties to the United States, and that individually have are kind of, I think, inclined to have strong ties to the United States and like the United States people. So we have an awful lot of assets there that we haven't focused on and celebrated that I think really could benefit.
I want to ask you another weighty question.
I was wondering what this billboard was.
It involves, see if I can do the turn.
Oh, dear Lord.
The turn correctly. Here it is. This is you, I believe, you were 51 at BB&N?
Yeah, luckily that's blurry, but yes.
What position did you play football at BB&N?
So I sadly have gained about probably 20 pounds since I was in high school. I was for you football fans out there, a center, guard, tackle, inside linebacker, and defensive end and captain of the football team my senior year. We did not win very many games. As that can probably show, I was beaten up and what is this?
This is another picture of you. It looks to me like number 51 there has managed to fall to the ground outside the center of action. I'm wondering if that's indicative of your football ability.
I'm pretty sure that guy has the ball and about to make a huge tackle.
Oh, okay, is that what was going to happen?
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Everybody over here is off the mark,
Exactly.
but this guy's. I was able to read through.
You saved the game right there.
I was able to read through the misdirection. I don't know what 58's doing over there, though. Thanks, Josh.
My pleasure. One more game. One more question.
On my football ability?
I think you'll be
Thank
better
you.
at this game than football, actually. I'm going to ask you a question
Ouch.
that I anticipate you're going to parry very artfully. Do you have any aspirations for higher office?
None right now.
Just as I suspected.
None right now.
And as a matter of reportorial due
Yes.
diligence, just to entertain our audience here, I'm going to try it this way. The conventional wisdom is that you're going to run for Senate when Senator Markey or Senator Warren retires. Is the Bay State hive mind right?
The conventional wisdom has been that Donald Trump was going to flame out 6 months ago, right? The conventional wisdom has been that Ben Carson would have as well. The conventional wisdom, as much as I love our convention, is seldom wise. Look, I think you've been around politics a long time. You've covered an awful lot of folks in our delegation. I ran for election once. I ran for re-election once, and I got another re-election coming up in another year. In case you are wondering, I am planning on standing for re-election, so there you go. Big, bold news, I hope. There you go. Congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Shocking.
Look, trying to you put together when you are fortunate enough to win an election, you spend an awful lot of time then trying to figure out, okay, well, or at least initially, okay, now what, and how do you break up your time and your staff and your focus and family and try to find ways to juggle an almost insurmountable amount of incoming and make sure that you allocate your time wisely. And I think rightfully, or interestingly, I should say, much of the focus of when I'm talking to folks about my job ends up being what we do legislatively down in Washington, D.C. And that's the big stuff, again, the tax reform, the healthcare reform, war and peace, and debt and deficit, and those are the big issues of the day. Half of my staff is here in Massachusetts, and they are all dedicated to serving our constituents. And that's with issues on Medicare, for veteran services, Social Security, challenges that they might have with their housing, any sort of immigration, anything that comes up. And Josh, it's those folks more than anything else that will dictate the success or failure of a member of Congress. When you work on stuff at a local level, it's never Democrat or Republican, it's how do you solve the problem? And what I have pledged to try to do is to serve those folks as most effectively, efficiently as I possibly can and answer those concerns and use the power of my office and the federal government to address them. And candidly, keeping that at the top of my priority list and not for nothing, trying to figure out how to be a new dad. which from what I understand ain't all that easy. They don't come with an instruction book, right?
So focused on your job, but not ruling out something later down the line.
Focused on my job, and look, we'll see way down the line. I do think that it's odd that being a member of Congress is potentially the only job that I know, or one of the only jobs, I guess many in politics, where you can be 33, 34 years old and everybody says, hey, when are you running for the next thing? Folks, give me a break, right? Like, I just got here. Let me focus on trying to learn my job and do my job well. You asked a number of really great questions on really complex and challenging issues that are before us in Washington, D.C. and before the State House here, and trying to navigate your way through them are, for me anyway, I take an awful lot of responsibility in that. And to try to do that job right and well and work my way through a newborn, which, again, I don't think there's a lot of sleep on my horizon. Like, I got a pretty full plate. And focusing on trying to get through that is probably all I got time for.
Before we go, I want to say thank you very much, and I want to get in a few audience questions in the few minutes we have remaining. Right, I know there was one from a Suffolk University student. Massachusetts has numerous colleges and universities, but many graduates choose to move elsewhere when they're done with their degree. What's a wise solution for this problem?
Great question, and one that I've been focused on a bit in trying to work through it. One of the big ones that you get often is housing costs, right? We are, Boston, the greater Boston area, is not a very affordable housing market. And without that, particularly for new graduates, if you're making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year, an awful lot of that paycheck's going to go to rent, when you could be going off someplace else and having an awful lot easier time finding someplace that you can afford, paying off your student loans, and then perhaps either staying with a job or going off to graduate school. We, as a community here at the federal, state, and local level, have to find ways to address it. When I was running on my first campaign, I went to college out in Silicon Valley at Stanford. I traveled out there and actually had a meeting with a Silicon Valley Bank, is a bank that focuses on financing for startups, and they've got a branch actually here in Newton. And so I contacted them, and I had some contacts with that branch out in Silicon Valley, and they pulled together a roundtable for me out there of companies that started here and then moved out there, and trying to understand what it was that actually drew them away from Massachusetts and to Silicon Valley. And unfortunately, folks, some of this isn't going to be surprising. The weather, right? Which, not much we can do about that. We're doing pretty good on sports teams, right? We're doing pretty good on culture. We're doing pretty good on other attractions to the city. We got to find, I think, the biggest thing out there is finding ways to try to make the city more affordable for folks that are just coming out of school. And I think I know Mayor Walsh is focused on that. I know an awful lot of folks are focused on that. The other piece that I would say about it is that can be something that can be alleviated a bit from public transportation and better transportation networks, to try to leave some of that pressure into communities like Sales Pitch for the District, Needham, Franklin, areas of further suburbs out that could try to get commuters into Boston.
A question from the audience. What are your thoughts about Paul Ryan becoming the new Speaker of the House? Does the Democratic Party view this as a benefit or a detriment to their ability to get bills passed?
So, great question. Look, I wish Paul Ryan an awful lot of success. I know him. I don't want to say I'm super close with him, but I know him. He's a decent man. The good side to this is, look, the House needs a leader. And for the month or so that was really in flux, it was even harder to get things done, believe it or not. We didn't know who was going to be there, so you try to work on different bigger deals, whether it was budget or others, and you're not sure who can actually deliver on it. Legislation and committee hearings, many of those were actually canceled because much of the focus of Republicans was trying to figure out who was going to be their next speaker. And caucus meetings and other things, the internal stuff that happens when the parties try to figure out what's going to happen next. And so much of the legislative process really ground to a halt. That's bad. We need to find something, or you need to have a leader there that actually can pull people together and then set forth an agenda and then deliver on it. So the good thing is that they've I think figured that out. The challenge I think going forward is really going to be up to Mr. Ryan. He has what I would say, and I think what most people would say is fairly clear, pretty strong conservative credentials. He has the ability to bring Republicans with him. So I think many of us expect that he's going to be a conservative speaker, but if he picks his spots and brings Republicans with him, he can actually build some pretty pragmatic legislation. It'll be up to him to see whether he's able and willing to do that, or if he wants to legislate more from a safe space on the ideological wing and pass legislation that can get through the House but will run into speed bumps in the Senate and not get signed by a Democratic president. So I think the choice really is up to him. I genuinely wish him well and wish him luck. Again, for the institution to function, we need to have some stability there.
Well, thank you, everyone. We wish you and we wish your wife luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Joe Kennedy. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it. And we're going to have a final word from Vice President John Nucci.
Our thanks go today out, of course, to Congressman Joe Kennedy, apparently occasionally known as Milkman, which we've learned, and of course to Josh Miller for his great questioning here today. Our next in the series of these events is going to be on December 15th at 5:30 with Senate President Stanley Rosenberg. It will be at the 20 Somerset Building, so mark your calendars. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Thank you, all of you, for watching online, and see you next time.